In my practice as an astrologer, helping people understand themselves and helping people understand why issues tend to repeat themselves, one of the most repeating issues amongst all people is the issue of self-worth. And it's an issue because it's noticeable in how it affects so much of the rest of our lives. Most importantly, it affects our financial lives. Self-worth is all about how we value ourselves and whether we value ourselves correctly. Astrology does have a lot to say about that when we do an individual chart reading, but it definitely has taught me that one of the bigger issues in our society is that so many of us don't know how to correctly value ourselves, and that so many of us suffer the consequences of not valuing ourselves correctly. Those consequences can include things like financial problems, personal problems, as well as problems in dealing with the world at large. So why is self-worth such an important issue? And of course, what can we do to change it? How do we improve our self-worth? We live in a world where we are constantly comparing ourselves to people, judging ourselves by what we have and haven't achieved, and of course doing the same for others. One of the most obvious ways that we experience that is by looking at self-esteem. What is our sense of our own esteem, value and status? And in recent times, psychologists have pointed out that the emphasis on self-esteem is actually an emphasis on things that come from the external world. If one of the most core issues that people face today is the issue of self-worth and how to value themselves, then focusing on self-esteem is probably not the best way to achieve self-worth. The way to focus on self-worth is then to bring things back to ourselves. If we continuously compare ourselves to others, essentially we are fighting a losing battle. Psychologist Kirsten Neff says there's always someone richer than you. There's always someone more successful or more attractive or better at something. So no matter how great you make your self-esteem based on those things, it can't really work because outside of you, there's always going to be the person who's able to do better than that. Self-esteem becomes this battle, a losing battle often, but can feel like you're trying to climb up a hill while the sand is slipping down and pulling you down. We need to find a way to detach it from the external world. Otherwise, our sense of self-worth bounces around from, I'm great because I've achieved that, oh no, that person achieved more, oh no, I'm not so great. Oh, I'm great because I just got a raise, oh, that person's being paid more. And so, as long as these outside things, outside factors define our self-worth, they actually become harmful to our mental health. They actually become harmful to our self-worth. It's been shown in studies that even with students who base their sense of self and self-worth on sources like their grades at school, their approval from other students, generally have higher stress and more problems at school and at university than other students, and often end up with more problems with alcohol or drug abuse or any other eating disorders, things which are often a sign of trying to maintain an esteem in the eyes of the world while not actually feeling that great about yourself. So self-worth and self-esteem are not the same thing, and self-worth needs to be based on things that come from ourselves. They need to be based on our internal world and our internal life. While it is important to have accomplishments and to be valued by other people, the value that other people give us should not be the source of the value that we give ourselves. We shouldn't be rating ourselves and comparing ourselves. We should just be being ourselves. So the first step in building self-worth is to stop comparing ourselves to others and to bring it back to ourselves in some way. And one of the ways to do that is to deal with that strong critical inner voice that all of us have, that often leads us into greater feelings of poor self-worth. Having high self-worth means that you accept yourself wholeheartedly. Whatever might be your problems, whatever might be your limitations, you accept yourself. This is the real me, here, now, at this time, in this situation. Let me start by accepting that, because by accepting that, I put the power back in myself. And by doing that, I've got the power to grow myself, or change myself, or increase my self-worth. What I've learned from people coming to see me is that very often many of the issues in our lives, be they financial issues, be they relationship issues, be they any other issues with the world, stem from not having good self-worth, not knowing how to value ourselves, and not making the effort to actually value ourselves or build our own value in some way. It sounds so simple, but many people realize as soon as I mention you don't know how to value yourself, that that is a key problem. If you have people owing you money, if you feel that you don't get paid enough, those are often indications that you don't know how to value yourself correctly. And if you don't know how to value yourself correctly, you're going to end up selling yourself short, not only in financial situations where people should be giving you money, but even in relationships. We often end up settling for second best in many situations. Again, be they relationships, be it the salary, be it the task at hand. And that's because we don't know how to value ourselves. So we say something like, well, okay, I'm obviously good enough for them, so I'll just go over there. Our sense of self should not be that we're good enough for someone else. It should always come from ourselves. What are my minimum requirements? What are my needs? What are my standards? That must determine the baseline of how I value myself. Far too often, our sense of value comes from relationships or other things that are outside of ourselves. The key to self-worth is to bring it back to ourselves. So, how do we improve on our self-worth? How do we work on fixing this problem? Of course, the most important thing is to understand what really determines self-worth and what isn't. We need to remind ourselves of the things that we've spoken about, that things in the outside world, how much money we have, our title in the world, how much people like us, how many likes our posts get, how much status we have in the world out there. It's easy to get caught up in those things, but in the end, those are not the things that determine our real worth. What we need to learn to do is to step back and ask ourselves, what really matters in my life? And a good way to even answer that question is to ask yourself, what do I value in other people? When I'm looking at another person that I think is an amazing person or a great person, what is it that makes me think so? And mostly the way that we determine value in other people is through them being kind, being respectful, treating ourselves and other people well, showing compassion. So those basic qualities which we seek and admire and value in other people are the qualities that we have to find in ourselves. A good step to start understanding the problem of finding them is recognizing our critical voice, recognizing that we've got this inner critic that tells us, you can't, you did that poorly, you're bad at this. Sometimes we need to recognize even where that voice comes from, and it so often comes from our past and our childhood, when our parents or other people are, of course, not really aware of the long-term consequences, but are giving us those judgments. Perhaps what they think is where they're encouraging us or inspiring us to do better. But in reality, those judgments stick with us, and they become this inner voice that tells us as adults that what we're doing is not good enough and it could be better. And that little critic undermines our sense of ourselves, undermines our ability to create these qualities in our lives that would give us greater self-worth, because we honestly end up thinking that we can't or we don't deserve it. So learning to find that inner voice and realize that whatever it is and whatever the truth is, that inner critical voice isn't actually an authentic me. It's been planted there by so many different things in my early life that might have been said innocently, but have all come together to create that critic that sits in there. So even if I think what it's saying seems true, I understand that it is not a valid voice. And so the first thing we need to do is tell the inner critic to wait, to pause, and hold back on those things, because we know those are not the things I'm going to judge this by. Whether or not they're true isn't even the question I'm asking. The thing is to say to yourself, I understand that those are not the way that I determine self-worth. What is the way that I determine self-worth then? Sometimes people find that the way to silence it is also to say, if I'm working on self-worth, then I've got to do this from self. So whatever these past ideas and past experiences and what other people have said about me and what my folks might have said to me, whatever they may mean, they're not relevant because I'm working on self-worth. And self-worth starts with my own identity, my own understanding of who I am, and it starts with accepting that. The first step to self-worth is self-acceptance. Accepting yourself with whatever flaws, whatever issues, whatever problems in the past, whatever you've done wrong. You've got to say to yourself, I am the only me that there is. My only option is really to accept myself, because there is no other self. I cannot change what's happened. If I want to move forward and be better and be a better person, this is the me I've got to take forward. So I will accept myself with all the flaws. If you try and say I've got to remove all the flaws first, then self-acceptance is hard to find. So you accept yourself first and saying, this is what I bring to the table, for better or worse. This is what I bring to the table. That's the beginning of also a process of loving yourself better. But it's really just saying, this is me, this is my identity, this is the only identity I have, this is what I bring to the table. The more we accept ourselves, the happier we are. Accepting ourselves requires compassion on ourselves, understanding of ourselves, understanding that things were done, things happened this way, things ended up this way, and learning that often what has made it into a negative experience is the feeling of shame for doing something wrong. Shame is also planted into us when we're very young, and we feel shameful often for doing things that are quite innocuous. So understanding that shame is a negative emotion that rarely has any value. So the why I might feel bad about myself is because I feel ashamed of something. And understanding that I wasn't able to control it, it happened to me, or even that I was wrong and it's now in the past. We need to let go of the shame because it is in the past, it's gone. And that's because very often feelings of shame and feelings of guilt are based on standards or requirements that at the time were not possible for us for whatever reason. How we ended up in the situation that caused shame was because what was expected of us was not possible. Even if it could have been, but at the time I didn't realize it. So letting go of these kind of exaggerated feelings of guilt, feelings of shame, all of those kind of things, which add to the problem of not accepting ourselves and therefore not understanding our real value. There are also things that you can do to build that. Anything you do to help you understand yourself and understand your life helps you on the process to self-acceptance and self-worth. I started off by saying as an astrologer, it's often when I experience people having these problems, and of course the great thing there is that visiting an astrologer is a part of the journey to self-understanding for most people. It's a way to mirror yourself, mirror your life, or see yourself that helps you actually let go of some of those past experiences and exaggerated feelings of guilt, shame, and those kind of things. There is a well-known kind of self-help guru called Adam Zikinski, who he says a great way to understand yourself is to imagine that everything you have is gone. Everything that you value, your relationships, your things, your career, your friendships, all the things. And ask yourself, if all I had left was myself, what would I have that's actually of value? And it forces you to look at things that you do, talents that you have, things that you actually have to entirely rely on yourself for, because that's where the source of self-worth is. The source of self-worth comes from you. So it helps you understand that no matter what else goes on in the outside world, in the end, I must rely on myself for self-worth or pretty much anything else, because the things I have could disappear. And his point, I think, is really that we must not base self-worth on any outside source, be it possessions or be it the feedback that we get from other people. Because as we saw, that's often the issue with confusing self-worth with self-esteem. That esteem is something that's often measured by the outside world. You did that well, you scored well, you did right. All of those things are not really so much about the self after all. So then, getting yourself back to all I have is myself, the first thing to tell yourself is, I'm responsible for me, I am what I have. Therefore, no matter what I've done, no matter what I haven't done, I'm worthy of love. A person who has high self-worth takes responsible for what they've done. They say, I did a bad thing, not I'm a bad person. They say sorry. All of those things mean I'm still a valid person, I'm still worthy of being loved, and therefore loving myself. The second thing to tell ourselves is, my things are not the same as me. What I have doesn't define me, and therefore what I have does not create self-worth. It's not money that creates self-worth. In fact, on the contrary, it's often self-worth that creates money. Because when you know how to value yourself, you know how to charge correctly for your services or ask for the salary you deserve, amongst other things. So my things are not me, therefore I don't draw self-worth from the outside world. Tell yourself, my feelings are valid, whatever they are, because they're the same feelings that other people have. None of us are unique in that way. We all experience the same range of human emotions. So we can understand that if I'm not feeling great, if I'm not feeling happy, that's actually fine. It's the same as what other people have. People who have great self-worth are not always going to be feeling happy. It's okay when I'm not feeling happy. In fact, all my emotions are valid. Because we often get told, you should be happy, you should be feeling this. And we get that critical voice that arises again. I can have self-worth even when it's a negative emotion. One of the known characteristics of people with high self-worth is that they're not afraid to be alone. They don't mind their own company. So telling yourself, it's fine if I don't go. For me, there's no such thing as FOMO, fear of missing out. I don't fear missing out anything. I'm fine with myself. I'm not afraid to be alone. We don't have to go to places in order to get social worth, to feel accepted, or to be seen. Those things are external sources, and therefore they can damage our self-worth. It's not really important what people think of us. It's such a relevant point in self-worth, to realize that What other people think about me is not my business. And when you put it that way, it helps you let go of that, because so many of us worry about what other people think. But when you realize what other people think is not my business any more than what I think is any of their business, I wouldn't want other people to know what's going on in my head. So you can turn it around and realize I shouldn't sit and worry about what other people are thinking, because it's none of my business what's going on in their heads. The only valid thoughts that determine my worth are my own. It's not unusual for our feelings of poor self-worth to come from things that have happened, and things that we might blame ourselves for, even things that we did. So it's always important to remember that it's not about what happens, it's about how we respond to that, what we do about that. It's asking ourselves questions like, did I respond with compassion? Did I understand what I couldn't control and let go of that? Am I feeling like a victim of what happened? And that's the one to bust yourself on. Am I a victim? If the answer is ever yes, then you're saying to yourself, then I'm blaming on I'm relying on what happened in order to feel okay as a person. And now I'm a victim, it happened to me, so I can't feel okay as a person. And you've got no control over that. Whereas if you say, this happened to me, and this is how I choose to respond to it, you now have control over that. You can respond in a way that isn't about self-pity, and that is about, well, in these circumstances, what do I have control over? And the one thing I might have control over is my own reactions and my own mood. I can do nothing about that, so let me go and do something that makes me feel happier. Bringing the control back to ourselves, seeing the agency in our own lives, gives us a sense of our own value. Another very important way to try and live our lives is to make sure that we love what we do. And the way to make sure of that is to do what you love. There are all sorts of have-tos and should-dos and pressures and things that actually make us choose a path that might not be the best path for us. In the end, the only valid path is the one that makes you feel you're doing something worthwhile to you. If you're trying to create a source of self-worth, then you must have a sense of what I do has value to me. So, do I look forward to it? Does it excite me? Does it give me a sense of I'm doing what I love? Doing what I love and loving what I do gives us a sense of value in what we do. Asking ourselves if other people like it or is it valid to them might be temporarily good, but as soon as that changes, our entire house of cards collapses. So we've got to make sure that we're depending on ourselves to judge that correctly. So it's almost like I don't care if they pay me for this, or I don't care what the outcome is. The doing of it gives me love, gives me a sense of passion, gives me a sense that I'm worth something because I'm loving what I do. Self-worth means I know how to do what works for me. And so if I love what I do what I love, then I'm concentrating on my own needs. And my own needs must come first if I'm to feel any kind of worth. Even if I'm to provide for other people, I must be able to provide for myself. Otherwise, how could I provide for them? Bringing it back to yourself. Seeing yourself in others is a great way to build your self-worth, because realizing that we're all the same helps us deal with judgment, helps us judge ourselves much less. So helping that is seeing ourselves in others, seeing them in you, realizing that we have the same flaws, that we make the same mistakes, that none of us are perfect or happy all the time, lets you let yourself off the hook. And seeing yourself in others, therefore, increases your own sense of your value, because you understand you're just as good as everyone else. Ultimately, we need to be grateful for who we are and what we have. What we have is not about the wealth that we have. It's about the experiences and the life and the people. Gratitude is one of the most powerful ways to build satisfaction in your life. It's come up in many different contexts on this show. I've said it often before, but learning to find things to be grateful for every day, even when they're small, trivial things, profoundly changes how people feel about life and how they feel about themselves. Self-worth has got a lot to do with how we feel about life and how we feel about ourselves. So probably the best, fastest and most powerful way to build your sense of self-worth is to teach yourself to be grateful every day for things that you have and for the person that you are. Self-worth arises out of that. There's always something we can do to improve. I'll see you here next week at the same time.